Welcome to the Consultants Way podcast, your go-to resource for all things professional services consulting. Brought to you by McMahon & Ransford, a strategy consulting firm with over 30 years of experience helping B2B organizations achieve sustainable growth, and the Consultants Way, the leading comprehensive consultant development program. Hosted by Dean McMahon and Anthony Paluska, we share expert insights, firsthand experiences, and conversations with industry leaders on the topics that interest you most.
The views and opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of their employer, company, or affiliated organizations.
Welcome back to the Consultants Way podcast. Anthony Paluska and Dean McMahon, and today we are joined by Pete Matchley. Pete, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you having me.
Absolutely. Pete, Pete's a Senior Director of Professional Services at Bright Edge Technology. And Pete, would you provide a little bit of kind of your background and experience to the audience for us before we dive into the topic today?
Yeah, sure. I'd be glad to. Well, I've started out my professional career in advertising. I spent about 15 years in advertising, working for a variety of large ad firms across all kinds of industries, but really specialized in automotive and B2B tech more than most. And after about 15 years in advertising and rising up through the ranks of account management, I took a career change. I went to a web analytics firm at the time who was in need of somebody to come in and take ownership over their customer success team. And so I took that on as a new challenge in my career and really enjoyed working on more of the MarTech side of the business and working with customers to help, really ensure they get the most value out of the products and services that we're offering at that firm. And then eventually I wound up in my current position where I've been running sales and account management for the professional services organization for several years now.
Yeah, tell us just a little bit about Bright Edge Technology and what you all work on.
Bright Edge is the leader in organic search marketing. We help folks of all different sorts of industries, sizes, globally, understand how they currently rank on Google and other search engines and how to improve that rank over time.
Well, Pete, we're excited to talk about this topic today. It's an interesting one for a couple of different reasons to us, right? And the reason is, right, you have lots of conversations. You tell people that you work in professional services or in consulting, and there's always a horror story or something that somebody goes back and tells and says, hey, we spent a bunch of money. We had some consultants come in. They had a great idea, and now it just lives on a proverbial shelf in our office somewhere, and we never implemented or acted on any of the things. And obviously that never happened to us or to you, of course, but other consultants.
Never. It's all hearsay. It has literally never happened to us. That's true.
So I can't relate to that problem. No, but it's a real situation, and there's lots of reasons for it, and like sincere reasons for an organization moving down a path and then not acting on some recommendations. Right. And so, but before we even dive into the topic at hand, as we were preparing for this, this was a topic you brought up. What inspired you to take on this meaty topic with us today?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a big one for sure, and it's I think it's something that a lot of folks within professional services struggle with, right? Whether you're selling marketing consulting services, like I've been doing most of my career, or you're selling implementation services where you're going to have your software part of an IT network or what have you. I think folks struggle with this across the board. And, in advertising too, you can come up with the best creative campaign idea, but we've all seen certain situations, you have the best idea, you're getting ready to go live and you're all excited about it. And then all of a sudden something comes out of nowhere and changes that situation. So, net at the end of the day is, I think we all know it's about producing results, right? And that starts not once you get the sale and you start doing the work. That starts actually pre-sale. Okay, so there's things that you can do pre-sale to really set the team up for success and to really ensure at the end of the day, if the customer is getting the value out of what you're selling, they will continue to, foster that relationship, and that relationship will grow over time. You'll both elevate yourselves, by doing great work that produces results. And sometimes, you can even implement things and you think this is going to happen, and the results don't take place the way you think. And that's okay, as long as you're learning and you're taking those learnings into the next phase. But generally speaking, like, I've actually had really good success when you have really tight sales acumen on what exactly the customer is trying to do, what are the metrics for success, getting executive buy-in, and ensuring that the team that's ultimately going to deliver the consulting is set up for success.
That's excellent. Yeah. That's very good. And those are some key words everybody should keep in their mind all the time, because it's so, as you said, it's so easy to, in the fog of war, if you will, get off track, right? Yeah, and allow internal politics or whatever. Anthony and I were on an account a few years ago, and they had a very complicated. It's a product company, had a very complicated problem. I thought, and I know I did, solve this complicated problem. Never implemented.
Yep.
Because it worked against some R&D beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
at the end of the day, who you're recommending the changes to, and the selling the dream, the vision, a lot of times they're not actually doing the thing on the back end that's actually going to make the change, that's going to make the aha happen, right? And so helping those folks get buy-in from the rest of the organization is going to be key.
And so we just talked, right? We're selling it to somebody that may be a natural resistor to it because they have some I'm not going to, ulterior motive is the wrong word for it, right? But they have some other
belief
or pressures that are working against that strategy or that recommendation going forward. What are some of the other reasons why you've seen professional service guidance get ignored or only partially implemented or not really realize the results that were laid out in a recommendation or a strategy?
Yeah, that's a great question, Anthony. One that comes to mind is around understanding, what that actual flow is. Okay, so if I'm recommending a customer do a bunch of content updates on their site, for example, what's the actual ownership of that customer has over those updates? Some can be done, for example, through a CMS, and they usually own the front end. But other things might be back end development, right? So they're going to be reliant on their tech team, their dev team, which is oftentimes in a completely different department, to do that. So, one thing that I've been getting asked more and more is like, okay, as a part of the sales process, help me understand the roadmap. So I might sell in a retainer, and that retainer might be, we have a decent idea of how we're going to use those hours over a period of time. And that's good to have a good idea of like, hey, what does the first 90 days look like? And on their end, here's the resources and, approximate time of those resources that are being required to actually implement those changes. Everybody has a boss, right? And so there's very rarely a situation where I sell something into somebody where they have full decision-making authority, right? They usually have to run it up to somebody. And to have that in hand helps not only get confidence and execute the sale, but it also kind of, thinks about things a long way down the road and make sure that that's not going to be a blocker when we get to that point.
Yeah. So in those cases, right now, okay, we've identified the right resources. We've set their expectations for what implementation looks like. At your organization today, how far do you work with them or sit with them to help them get that implementation started and actually drive it to some of those outcomes? Because we're seeing a lot more of this, almost a shift or an evolution of professional services into managed services in some cases, because the client's just not going to get the outcome anyway, and they recognize that up front. So are you guys seeing some of that as well?
Absolutely. In my services experience, leadership and individual contributor, me as well, like I stay connected to it, right? And so if I sell something in as a salesperson or even as a department lead, I want to stay connected to what's going on and have a presence in these conversations where we're delivering the recommendations, even looking at materials before they go to the customer, thinking about it through their lens. But also, yeah, it's a great idea to, be a part of the, help that customer actually take it from here's a concept to now what do I do with it? Absolutely 100%, and PMs can be really valuable in helping them track things that, here's our next steps, here's where we're at, here's generally agreed upon timelines, and then checking in on things and just reminding people and, hey, would it be helpful if I, do you need me to help coordinate with your resources, and just offer that up. A lot of times folks say I got it, but sometimes they actually find that really helpful.
Yeah. And how do you navigate that, right? So
Yep.
so you're selling into this. Let's say you see that there's all these signs that they're saying they want our help, but
Mm-hmm.
we've done some of the things that you've just talked about, and you can see very clearly because you've seen lots of these
Yep.
go well and poorly before, and hey, they're going to get to the end of this and they're not actually going to be prepared to take this on. How early in the process do you bring that up? How do you navigate that piece of things, and helping to on the front end communicate to the client the risks that are in front of them?
Yeah, and I think we've been talking about a lot of the operational and executional stuff. Things get a lot easier when folks understand the business value of if I do this, then what, right? And so, that certainly helps clear the path for implementation. And so having that, very rarely do I see a sales cycle where folks aren't saying, well, if I buy this, what do I gonna get out of it, right? And so naturally, ROI projections are, most people do them as a part of the sales process. And then one of the great things with, especially the work that I've been doing in my last couple of roles is that once you actually get into the data, you're actually able to provide a lot even more accurate forecast of what you can expect from XYZ recommendations, right? And so then it's going from more of a conceptual to more of a, no, this is actually real, more well baked data. We've done the research. We have a much better understanding of the impact, and oftentimes it's better. You usually want to be more conservative up front, right? And then have things actually be look even better once you actually dig into the data. So that in itself will help clear the way. Usually we want to make sure that not only, a lot of times I'll do a run through with our, the main point of contact, get their feedback, make sure that we're dialed in, and then have a second conversation. Make sure that we bring in the executive leadership into what we're recommending, get their buy off. Once that's happened, things go a lot smoother. Even when you're going cross departmental, having an executive that can clear the way goes a long way.
Pete, you brought up two really important points. I don't want people. You made them sound so matter of fact. One is keep your client updated on your view of the changing outcomes,
Yes.
and I'll add to that. Look down the road and tell them what's going to be a problem, right?
Yep.
Because you're an expert. The second thing is continue to get executives education and buy-in, and that doesn't mean just getting to participate, right?
Exactly.
A lot of time we're wasting their time if we're not structuring it and enlightening them and motivating them. So I love that you said those things.
Great. Thank you.
So let's say that you're in a situation that you feel the ghost behind the thing moving away from you. You're losing the momentum. You feel the recommendations are going to dissipate. Have you got any magic sauce for? Do you just walk away from them and write their name off your list, or is there a way we can rescue an organization that is, you have fear they're not going to get the benefits or implement?
A normal situation where that is gonna happen is when you have a changing of contacts on the customer side. We work with a lot of big organizations, right? And these folks, if they're not if their job's not changing every 18 months or whatever it is, they're probably doing something wrong, right? Like that's how large organizations kind of keep things fresh and motivate people, and how people, go up the ladder. So, basically expecting that's going to happen, there's a good chance of that happening, is probably a good idea to kind of have, in your back pocket, right? But, ensuring that at the end of the day, your things are going to come at you, right? And there might be delays, and that's okay. It's just fine. But having communication, transparent communication, especially, right, is really important. And if things have to get sidelined for a minute, so be it. But be proactive and be checking in with those folks, and be thinking about, like, okay, if I'm in your shoes, what else could I be doing to help you out, and offer options up, and do everything you can do at the end of the day to really try to make that customer successful. And sometimes there's just going to be things outside of your control that it just is what it is, right? But I put reminders on my calendar, right? So it's like, okay, it's one thing to say that you're going to follow up, but it's another thing to actually do it. And so to ensure that I can manage my calendar and those things don't fall through the crack, I literally put those events on my calendar with appropriate reminders for a couple of days before, so that, I can keep on top of all that stuff, and it doesn't fall through the cracks. My team does that as well.
Yeah, one thing we've been advocating, which is the same thing, just a little more deliberate, is a place where we keep track of all the executive relationships we're building, and one person holds everybody accountable, because we also deal with massive companies, and that churn is always the fear in 3-year programs, right? So we want to make sure, we if we don't know them and are friends with them, we at least know their friends, right?
Yep,
and
exactly.
we work that very, very hard. And that also is a great way to get additional work in different areas. But we find, but the central, clearinghouse, and how did that meeting go? Did he understand? Did she understand? What? Yeah, we really like that, because when we rely on individuals, you're doing a good job, but a lot of people don't. Right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people will not, because of their personality or whatever, aren't going to keep and maybe they don't know how to add value to every meeting, but we want to make sure for large programs that works.
Absolutely. And it's sometimes it's easier said than done, but yeah, mapping up the organization, exactly to your point, Dean, understanding, it's not just about one person, it's about a group of folks, right? And understanding, what that org structure looks like. As I mentioned before, making sure that you have other folks involved that are in it to win it, outside of the main POC, helping manage up to their superiors and across the organization as well is definitely key to that.
I always use a story of an ex-neighbor of mine who's just a wonderful guy, German. And he had a great business where they were in shipping, right? And it was a great business. Made a lot of money, didn't take up much of his time. Let me go over that again. Made a lot of money. I wish we all had those businesses.
Yeah, right.
Then one day he told me his business was terrible. Just terrible, and couldn't be recovered. And I asked him what happened. He goes, well, all the guys I know retired. So the buyers, you knew no one below them? You spend no time? No. We all grew up together. I just knew those people, right? And that's what will happen every time. Yeah,
absolutely. And you'll find out that some folks are going to be understandably reluctant to bring too many folks into the room, right? Like they kind of want, they want to get used to you. They want to understand, okay, this sounds great, but I've probably been down this road before with other vendors, and some have held up to the expectations and some have not, right? And so ensuring that, at the end of the day, you're focused on them first and making sure that you're delivering excellence to them. They will bring in the other folks.
You will have a right to go talk to people.
Exactly.
And it's another great, Pete, you're making a lot of great points here. Hey, we are in the consulting business.
Mm-hmm.
First and foremost, we have to win the consulting journey and be successful and be the people they want to work with. Everything else depends on that.
Yep.
Right.
Exactly.
And we've all dealt with, and particularly us, because we deal with consulting firms all the time. We all dealt with, well, this isn't working, and it's not working because you didn't do the work. You're not being successful. You're not selling a product only, right? You're selling a journey, a client journey for success. Yeah.
And then, I mean, as Anthony actually brought up a little bit ago, having folks, that can actually help, you know, take action on what it is that you're recommending, it is a good idea. I've worked for a number of organizations that have adopted that strategy, and I've also worked for organizations that have, everything's about margin these days, right? So it's like, okay, are there certain pieces of the puzzle that we can also, outsource or sends overseas and get, labor at scale that can jump in and help not only our production cycles, but where it makes sense, customer production cycles as well. At the same time, though, when you're changing something on somebody's website, there's things that you want to have access to, and there's things that you do not want to have access to as a third party vendor, right? The last thing you want to do is, do something detrimental to that person's business, right? But there's a number of things that certainly you could do from a managed services perspective that we found that customers like, yeah, actually, for the folks in the right, situation, that makes a lot of sense. For other folks that are big, large global customers, they're never going to let us touch that stuff. So, having options for all sizes does make a lot of sense, and I've seen success with that as well.
So let's, given a lot of your advice here, we've now we've sold this effectively. We've got the right people engaged. We're building relationships at all levels within the organization so that we're prepared for any turnover. We've aligned to the client's goals and long-term expectations, and we've provided them a strategy. And maybe we're even helping them on the front end of that a little bit. At some point, inevitably, they're going to say, thanks, we've got this. We're going to keep on moving on. And maybe that's because the budget ran out for external support, right. Or maybe that's just because psychologically they need to cut the cord and actually own this internally and move on. We still want them to be successful, even though they're not engaged as a client with us anymore. Do you have any tips or tactics for how to help ensure them their success through the overall journey when they say we can't, we'd love to, but we can't have you guys helping us out with this anymore. But we know that there's still more work that they have to own and they have to do on a go-forward basis. Any guidance for us there so that they can still get the value out of that? They can still 2 years from now look back and say, wow, that was a really successful engagement that we had.
Absolutely. And in every, projects take their, they all have their own journeys, as Dean even mentioned, right? And so success might mean, hey, you've given me a lot of great things. You've helped me understand why I need to do this. I need a minute just to get this stuff figured out. I got it. I'll take it from here. Oftentimes that's fine. But I do, I am just a curious individual at heart, and I care about my customers at the end of the day. So, what I'll do, again, kind of going back to the idea of like, I don't want to just let it die there. I'm going to come back to them. The folks that I work with are ultimately today are software customers of my company, right? So they're still involved. They still have a relationship with the company. That's not ending. And so I'll check back in with them. I'll join a meeting that, the other folks on the customer success side might have set up, and just check in with them from time to time and see how things are going. I might even just get into the, whatever I'm using to analyze success of the program. In this case, would be our software. I'm just going to jump in there and see, hey, am I noticing any notable changes in the, in the data side that might be a result of them implementing something? And then go, hey, analysts that helped with this, could you, take a look at the code on the site, or, let's go back to the recommendations and let's just see, if this might actually be, attributed to something. Bringing customers interesting tidbits with actionable data is never a bad idea, right? It's like there's a lot of data out there. I'm surrounded by it every day, but helping folks understand, well, hey, I was thinking about your business. I noticed some things. I'm not sure if you had a chance to get to that. However, this was really interesting, and I thought you'd like to, at least see it, and maybe, we can have a conversation about it. That's never a bad idea. Thinking about folks' business without being on the clock, you know, just be a good partner at the end of the day. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's great. That's great. You have to care about them. You have to really honestly care, and therefore your advice is true and rings
Mm-hmm.
true, and that gives you the open door to always come back and say, "Hey, did you think about this? Did you?"
Yep.
Yeah, I like that. Very good.
Yep. Invest in the customers that, you know, that are great customers, right? And so if somebody's giving you money to do something, you've gotten through that, they've shown interest in you. Down the road, I have no problem investing a little bit of time and energy into their business to, whether it leads to something, if it does, that's obviously great. But, just being a value added partner, you're never gonna be asked, don't contact me when you have something interesting to say.
Yeah, if you pay forward and do good things, it always pays off. It may not
Yep.
pay off here, but and
Yeah,
I've had it, and I know you have two people. I've had instances where they didn't buy, but they recommended me to someone else.
absolutely. I see
Yeah,
that all the time.
yeah,
All the time.
yeah.
Yep.
Good stuff.
Yeah, it puts you in the top percentile of advisors, consultants, professional
Mm-hmm.
services, what have you, in their mind, because so few organizations are actually thinking about their customers after the contract ends and taking the time to work on that. I have a very similar example. Last week, actually, we did some work with a client almost throughout the entire year last year. We did some commercial
Mm-hmm.
transformation work and did a bunch of different things. But one of the big pieces that we drove was their annual planning process for their new go to market strategy.
Okay.
And it was that time again, and we hadn't been working with them for a couple of months, and I checked in on, hey, how's that part of the process going? Because everything else was a recurring process, and the leader said, oh gosh, I have 3 new leaders. They weren't exposed to this process last year. They're having to go through it. What would it take for you to come in and spend some time walking them through all of that? And I
Mm-hmm.
was like, yeah, well, I mean, we could spend some time. And I couldn't tell you how shocked they were when we were willing to just do that on their behalf instead of draw up an engagement letter and do so. It's a couple of hours. It's to
Yeah,
refresh some people, but it's so that they can get the actual outcomes out of this whole thing. What was the point of them paying for all of this if they changed their team and they weren't able to get it? If
absolutely.
we couldn't just pass along some knowledge and some information, but the fact that they had this attitude that, hey, is it going to be too expensive for you to come in for a couple of hours to just do that, just tells you that there's too many organizations that are not focused on the client outcomes. They're focused only on what does this mean about my business and our ROI. And I just believe that if you're focused on the client's business, it's going to pay itself back, whether it's through business through them, or like Dean said, referrals and other things in the
For
future.
sure.
It's amazing.
And to your point, Anthony, knowing the customer's business cycles, right? That's key. Understanding when are their budgeting cycles based on their fiscal year, and just having a good understanding of that, and planning around that, strategically. I mean, it helps them out because they're probably struggling with something, and then checking with them, hey, I think your budget cycle's coming up. Would it make sense, to get together and think about other ways that we could help you out? There's no harm in making the ask. They can always say no, but if you produced value for them, they're usually like, yeah, actually, I wouldn't mind that. Let's have a quick Teams call, and if it makes sense, come on site, and we'll go from there.
Well, Pete, this has been great. It's clearly a topic we feel and we're passionate about, helping to make sure that our
Absolutely.
clients, yours, ours, and everybody, right, gets the value out of what they originally purchased and the long-term recommendations that were provided to them as part of an engagement. So I appreciate you bringing this topic up and making the
You
time
bet.
to talk about it. Are there one or two things that you would want to summarize and put a point on for the audience before we let you go today?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. Yeah, I think the biggest thing I'd want to leave you with is, number one, put yourself in the shoes of your customer. Think like your customer. What would you want if you're in their shoes? What would you find valuable? So, to the best of your ability, think like your customer, whether that's pre-sale in terms of, um, what that flow is, keeping things moving, taking good notes, sending recaps, recapping what they've asked you to do, what their goals and objectives are, making sure that you have things are tight from a sales perspective, that you're listening to them, you're documenting that, and you're passing that on to the team and setting that team up for success. Once you've got the sale and you're into the work, don't disengage. Keep engaged. Don't show up randomly. Have a presence. It doesn't have to be every conversation. Have a presence. If you really like what you do, you'll be interested in the work and you'll be tied to their outcomes. So just follow your heart, do what's right by the customer, and things will be good.
That's great. I think great advice for everybody in the industry. So Pete, we appreciate you spending time with us today, and we can't wait to catch up next time.
I appreciate it. Thank you both.
Well, I thought that was a really good topic. I thought Pete did a really great job with it. It morphed into more than the linear get your recommendations understood and bought in. I like that he mapped it out from, hey, the first time you talk to him, as we always think about the first time you talk to him, how to stay engaged, how to stay relevant, how to add value to every conversation, how to make them important. I loved your example from last week that this is a profession. It's a wonderful profession, and there's some rules of behavior, if you allow me. And I liked it. I thought it was a great conversation.
Yeah, I'm glad he brought it up. It's one of those topics that when I'm interviewing new consultants to our team, or I'm just talking to other newer consultants, or somebody that's looking to transfer into to professional services, they sometimes will ask the question, hey, what's your least favorite part of the job? And I said the most difficult thing about consulting is not the figuring out how to solve the problem or the doing the work or any of those kinds of things. It is this constant fear that I live with, which is, hey, we're going to make recommendations. The client paid for those recommendations, and then they ultimately don't see them through to the end. And that's because of a lot of different reasons, right? You can, when you can see so clearly a little bit forest through the trees that to your example earlier, right? The organization needs to go in this direction, but they're holding themselves back for some reason, whether that's internal politics or budget or whatever. That's the most frustrating part. And so and for me, right, and for our firm, it kind of changes the attitude of how we approach everything, which is, okay, if that's our biggest fear, what are all the things we need to do along the journey, pre-sales, through delivery, through after we're done engaging with them, to make sure that they get those outcomes? And it's because it's such a fear, it's become the thing that we focus on quite a bit. And so I'm glad.
Yeah, we talk about it a lot. Which does remind me of one quick story. There was a huge company, and we had done a global analysis and gave them recommendations that were tough to do. There was a very tough set of recommendations. And a few years later, the CEO, she was talking to their CFO and said, hey, we got, what do you want to do about this? He said, why don't you call Dean? She goes, I don't think his recommendations worked last time. And he said, well, you didn't do them. So she called me actually and apologized, because in her mind, and that's the problem with this, you're blamed if they don't do it.
Yep.
Yeah, and we became very close friends, and it worked out really well. But yeah, I was like,
it's tough, but it's, I mean, you just have to, because of that, you just have to take the attitude of, hey, this is our responsibility that the client gets the outcomes out of whatever it is we're recommending. And I don't know if you remember this one. This is maybe 10, 12 years or so ago. We had healthcare, big one of the large device manufacturers, and they wanted to do a project, and their project was focused on they wanted to buy intellectual property to start a separate consulting arm within their business. And we go through the whole process, and we're proposing, and we were doing some other work with them, and we come to find out they wanted to buy the intellectual property from their biggest client. And they had no real intent of doing it. They were just trying to go through the process of how would we commercialize it. And we were like, all right, we want no part of this project.
That's right.
We don't want to go through the effort of not just putting our team through that time, but just go through the effort of people thinking that their organization is bought into doing something and that we're helping them do that. And we put together a strategy that we know is never going to go anywhere because it was a check the box exercise for them. And so,
Yeah, we don't ever want to be part of that kind
when
of
that
stuff.
drives kind of your philosophy, it does change some of the projects that you will and won't take though.
Yeah, amen to that.
Oh man! All right. Well, if you enjoyed this one and what Pete had to say, and obviously Dean and I could swap stories on this for a long time, you can find us at YouTube or on your podcast networks. So like, subscribe to see more of this. Reach out to Dean or myself on our LinkedIn pages, or feel free to email the show at podcast@consultantsway.com. Thanks everybody. We'll see you next time.